HOA president ordered workers to tear down my father's wheelchair ramp. She said it made the neighborhood look ugly. My father was trapped inside his own home, staring at a front door he could no longer use. Then Marjorie Blake showed up in a pink suit, smiling like she had already won. But she forgot one thing: discrimination leaves a paper trail. Subscribe, because what happened next turned our quiet street into a courtroom battle. The first splinter of sunlight glinted off polished oak as Robert Miller's wheelchair sat stranded at the top of a narrow wooden ramp, his hands trembling on the wheels, frozen mid-gesture as if the world had just stopped. A sudden clack of high heels on the concrete driveway shattered the morning calm, sharp and deliberate, each step announcing a presence that seemed to drain the air from the street. Ethan turned, heart hammering, as a figure in a shocking pink suit emerged from behind the maple trees, hair white and cut in a precise bob that framed a smile so cold it could slice through steel, a thick binder clutched under one arm, and eyes that scanned the ramp like a predator, assessing its prey. The ramp itself gleamed, the grain of the oak alive with morning dew, a lifeline built painstakingly over weeks for a man who had not felt independent since the stroke, a bridge to the world beyond the threshold of his own home. Robert's knuckles whitened as he gripped the rims, sensing the sudden intrusion, the threat, the quiet judgment of a neighborhood frozen mid-step. Marjorie Blake stood at the bottom of the driveway, her posture rigid, shoulders squared, radiating authority in a way that made Ethan's stomach knot, her lips curling slightly as though she had already drawn the final lines of the battle before it even began. She opened the binder with a crisp snap, the pages fanning out like the wings of some predatory bird, and Ethan's eyes caught the bold heading on the top sheet. Violation of community aesthetic standards. Immediate removal required. The words felt heavier than lead, each syllable pressing into the air around them, suffocating, as she leaned slightly forward, delivering a gaze that silenced the chirping of the sparrows perched on the nearby fence. Ethan's voice caught in his throat as he tried to explain, pointing to the ramp, to the gentle slope that had become Robert's freedom. But her expression remained unreadable, almost sculpted, her smile not softening as she lifted a manicured finger to pause him, tilting her head like a judge passing sentence. The wind stirred, rattling the leaves along the street, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut wood from the ramp, mingling with the metallic tang of fear that coated Ethan's mouth. Robert's eyes flicked to the window of the neighbor's house across the street, where Nora Kim peered from behind lace curtains, her fingers pressed tight to the glass, eyes wide, silently pleading, but trapped by her own dread. The sound of paper shuffling echoed, deliberate, as Marjorie's gaze swept the front yard once more, lingering on the oak grain, the careful joinery, the fragile independence it represented, before snapping back to Ethan with a cold, unyielding clarity. "Rules are rules," she seemed to say, without uttering a single word. Minutes stretched and thickened, the tension pooling in the space between the ramp and the curb, until a smaller envelope landed with a thud at Ethan's feet, the sharp official stamp of the HOA blazing on its front. He picked it up, fingers stiff, eyes scanning the fine print that spelled out a penalty of $500 a day for every sunrise the ramp remained, a relentless countdown ticking toward the potential erasure of his father's mobility. Robert exhaled slowly, a trembling sound that seemed to vibrate through the boards of the ramp itself, and Ethan's hands clenched as the binder snapped shut in one precise motion, Marjorie's heels retreating back toward the street, leaving an echoing silence that seemed to whisper a single terrifying question. How do you fight when the law itself feels like the enemy? The sun had barely climbed above the maple leaves when a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the Miller house, Marjorie Blake stepping out like a storm incarnate, her pink suit glowing against the pale morning, hair white and sharp as winter frost. She carried a stack of photographs, each one a high-angle shot of the oak ramp, gleaming in the morning light, taken as if from a drone, hovering above the street, and laid them out on the hood of her SUV with deliberate precision. Ethan's stomach knotted as neighbors peeked from windows and doors, drawn to the unusual display, the quiet of the street, punctuated only by Marjorie's deliberate footsteps, and the soft metallic clink of the binder closing, a sound that seemed louder than the engine of the SUV itself. The ramp, once a quiet symbol of Robert's regained independence, now became a public exhibit, framed as an offense against the entire neighborhood, and Ethan could feel the eyes of Maple Grove's silent community, pressing in, measuring, judging, ready to whisper behind closed doors. Marjorie's gaze cut to Robert, who sat stiffly at the top of the ramp, a thin line of sweat glimmering on his forehead, hands gripping the wheels in a tense tremor. She moved with a predator's confidence, flipping through the photographs, pointing with a manicured finger, as if demonstrating an architectural flaw in a gallery, her voice carrying across the street though her lips barely moved. The words community standards and aesthetic violation hung in the air, each syllable a weight pressing against Robert's chest, his independence reduced to a crime in the eyes of the neighborhood. Ethan stepped forward, the muscles in his jaw tight, heart racing with that familiar pulse of helpless fury, pointing toward the ramp as he tried to speak, to explain that this slope was not decoration but a lifeline, that the 3 smooth planks of oak beneath his father's wheels were freedom incarnate. Marjorie raised a hand with the precision of a conductor, cutting off Ethan mid-sentence, her smile never faltering, as she gestured toward the side door, the one with 3 unforgiving steps and the gravel path, entirely useless for a wheelchair. Silence fell, heavy and accusing, broken only by the distant creak of a neighbor's gate, a reminder that they were all watching, weighing the cost of dissent, caught in a quiet, suffocating moral theater. Robert's lips trembled as he shook his head slightly, eyes glimmering with shame and fear, whispering that Ethan should just take it down, that he didn't want his son dragged into a battle with the entire neighborhood over a ramp. The words cut deeper than Marjorie's cold, deliberate critique. They carried the quiet despair of a man who had fought fires and storms, only to be trapped by boards and nails in his own home. Ethan's resolve hardened, his eyes burning with defiance, refusing to dismantle the one structure that let his father breathe freely. The tension between them was almost tangible, the air vibrating with unspoken arguments, history, love, and fear, all layered into that fragile morning. Every leaf seemed suspended, every bird frozen mid-flight, as if the world itself had halted to witness whether independence or control would prevail on this narrow strip of maple-streaked wood. By mid-morning, Marjorie had called in her crew, 3 men in hard hats carrying measuring tapes and clipboards, moving methodically around the ramp, snapping photographs and marking lines on the ground with yellow chalk. Their presence turned the driveway into a construction zone, each tap of a hammer in the distance echoing against the house like a heartbeat, threatening Robert's fragile confidence. Ethan tried to intervene, gesturing toward the slope, but the men hesitated only briefly before continuing under the silent approval of Marjorie, who stood back with the perfect posture of authority, hair glinting in the light, eyes fixed on Ethan and Robert, as if daring them to protest further. Fear and anger collided in Ethan's chest. He could feel his father shrinking under the scrutiny, a man who had spent decades rescuing others now helpless, immobilized by neighborhood politics, and a woman in a pink suit who treated the street like her private stage. Meanwhile, across the street, Nora Kim peeked from behind the lace curtains, her eyes wide and hands pressed to the glass, witnessing a pattern she had seen before. Her son, Oliver, had once been reprimanded for drawing chalk figures on the sidewalk, and now she recognized the same quiet cruelty in Marjorie's eyes. Her pulse quickened with the knowledge that this was bigger than one ramp, that Marjorie's obsession with neatness masked a relentless drive to control anyone who dared to need accommodation. The danger became clear. If Ethan and Robert faltered, the entire block could be next. Neighbors coerced, elderly, children, and those with invisible disabilities alike, bending under a law of appearances rather than justice. Nora clenched her fists, torn between fear of HOA retaliation and the instinct to act, a silent witness to the slow escalation of intimidation. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp vibration that cut through the haze of heat and tension. A single message blinked on the screen from an old student, Caleb, reminding him that there might be someone who could fight for them, someone who knew the law, someone who understood what Marjorie was doing. But as Ethan looked back at the ramp, now measured, marked, and under the cold scrutiny of the crew, he realized just how isolated they were. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound amplified, and Robert's hands shook as he grasped the rims, as if the ramp itself was trembling in fear of its own removal. The neighborhood held its collective breath, the stakes now extending beyond aesthetics, threatening dignity, freedom, and the quiet pulse of a life rebuilt after tragedy. A sudden crack from a dropped measuring tape snapped Ethan's gaze upward, just in time to catch Marjorie's eyes glinting with satisfaction, a predator surveying her conquest before the kill. The sun reflected off her pink suit, turning it almost luminescent, a cruel halo framing the woman who had just decided that Robert's independence was expendable. Ethan swallowed hard, fear coiling around his ribs, anger and despair mixing in a toxic brew, as he realized that this morning, this measurement, this single act could decide whether the ramp would survive or be torn down, and with it, the fragile freedom his father had fought so hard to reclaim. The first strike came while Ethan was standing in front of a classroom whiteboard, writing the word reconstruction in blue marker. At almost the same moment, miles away, a hammer bit into the oak ramp outside his father's house, and Robert Miller heard the sound from his wheelchair like a bone cracking in the walls. He rolled toward the front door, breath shallow, one hand dragging slightly against the wheel, and through the glass, he saw Marjorie Blake, standing in the driveway, in her pink suit, white hair glowing under the hard morning sun, watching two maintenance workers tear into the ramp as if they were removing trash. The house felt suddenly too large around Robert. Every hallway stretched thin with panic, every framed family photograph staring back at him like witnesses that could do nothing. He pushed harder, the rubber wheels squeaking over the wood floor, one slipper sliding loose from his foot as he reached the threshold and tried to angle himself toward the damaged ramp. Outside, one worker pried up a board with a crowbar, splinters flying into the flower bed Ethan had planted for spring, while Marjorie held a clipboard against her chest and kept her face perfectly still. Robert lifted one trembling hand toward the glass, not pounding, not shouting, just trying to be seen, but the man with the crowbar looked away the moment their eyes met. When Robert forced the door open, the morning air rushed in cold and bright, carrying the smell of fresh split oak and dust. His front wheels caught where the first plank had already been loosened. The chair jolted sideways, and his body folded against the armrest with a soft, terrible thud. For a second, no one moved. The crowbar hung in the air. The second worker froze with a drill in his hand, and Marjorie's smile disappeared just long enough to reveal something sharp beneath it. Not regret, not fear, but calculation. Robert was not badly hurt, but the fall did something worse than bruise him. It made him look small in his own doorway, half inside and half outside, trapped between the home he owned and the world he could no longer reach. Across the street, Nora Kim stood behind her curtain with her phone in both hands, recording through a gap in the lace. Her fingers shook so badly the video trembled, but she kept filming as Robert struggled to right himself, and Marjorie motioned for the workers to continue. Nora's son Oliver stood behind her in dinosaur pajamas, silent for once, clutching a box of sidewalk chalk against his chest. He had learned Marjorie's name the way children learn the word storm, not because anyone explained it, but because every time she appeared, the adults became quiet. Nora knew what would happen if she spoke up. The unpaid HOA notices on her kitchen counter were already stacked beneath a magnet shaped like a sunflower, and one more complaint from Marjorie could turn her fragile life into a legal nightmare. By the time Ethan's phone started vibrating during fourth period, half the ramp was gone. He saw 3 missed calls from his father, then one blurred photo from Nora's number showing broken boards scattered across the porch like wreckage after a crash. He left school with his lessons still unfinished, driving too fast through Maple Grove's clean, tree-lined streets, past trimmed lawns and matching mailboxes that suddenly looked less like a neighborhood and more like a row of locked doors. When he pulled into the driveway, he found nails glittering in the sunlight, sawdust caught in the grass, and his father sitting just inside the open doorway with his eyes fixed on the empty space where the ramp had been. Ethan did not speak at first. He stepped over a broken oak plank, crouched in front of Robert, and saw the red scrape along his father's wrist, the grayness in his face, the humiliation he was trying to swallow, because pain was easier to admit than shame. Marjorie stood beside the workers as if she had been waiting for him, the clipboard now open to a neat stack of papers, with official-looking stamps and signatures. Her voice stayed smooth while she presented the removal order, the violation record, and a board authorization Ethan had never seen before. There were names on the page from people he recognized, neighbors who barely attended meetings, signatures that looked too straight, too uniform, too perfect. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers stepping carefully around the debris, their expressions shifting from concern to discomfort as soon as Marjorie handed them the documents. Ethan tried to explain that his father had fallen, that the ramp was medical access, that no one had permission to destroy it, but Marjorie had already built a paper wall around the truth. The officers studied the order, looked at the damaged ramp, then at Robert in the doorway, and their sympathy faded into the tired caution of men who had been trained to avoid the wrong kind of dispute. To them, it became civil. To Ethan, it became something much darker. His father was trapped in his own home, while everyone with a badge and a clipboard looked for a reason not to act. That evening, the Miller house sat under a bruised purple sky, the broken ramp casting jagged shadows across the porch. Ethan posted one sentence in the Maple Grove resident group, his hands still smelling of sawdust and metal from gathering the nails out of the grass. My father cannot leave his house because the HOA tore down his wheelchair ramp. For almost 3 minutes, the post stayed there, stark and impossible to ignore. Then, it vanished. No warning, no explanation, just erased from the screen like Robert's fall had never happened. But someone had seen it. Caleb Wright, one of Ethan's former students, sent a screenshot before the page refreshed, followed by a message that made Ethan sit upright in the dark kitchen. Caleb wrote that this was not just an HOA issue, not just a neighborhood dispute, and definitely not something Ethan should fight alone. He said Ethan needed an ADA lawyer immediately, because what Marjorie had done might have crossed a line she could not uncross. Across the street, Nora sat at her kitchen table, watching the video on her phone with tears in her eyes, while Oliver quietly colored a picture on construction paper. He drew Robert in his wheelchair at the top of a wooden bridge, and at the end of that bridge, he drew a yellow sun so large it filled half the page. Nora folded the drawing carefully, walked through the dark with her heart pounding, and left it on the Miller porch beside the broken boards. Ethan found it, just as his phone rang from an unknown number. Then, he answered with sawdust on his hands, his father silent behind him, and a woman's calm voice on the other end said her name was Lauren Pierce. Then she asked him to tell her exactly what the HOA had done before anything else disappeared. The afternoon sun slanted low across the Maple Grove street, casting long shadows over broken oak planks, scattered like fallen soldiers on the Miller porch. And a black SUV rolled silently into the driveway, with an authority that felt almost invisible, yet immediately commanding. Lauren Pierce stepped out, briefcase in hand, her eyes scanning the remnants of the ramp, the small chips of splintered wood, the dents in the railing where Robert had struggled. Noting every detail with a meticulous calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos lingering in the air. Her gaze lingered on Robert, seated stiffly in his wheelchair, shoulders hunched, the morning humiliation still etched in the lines of his face, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of every unfair glance, every judgmental neighbor, as if the entire block pressed against them. Silent, waiting for disaster. Lauren moved deliberately, crouching to measure the remaining slope of the ramp, flicking through the HOA notices, the violation letters, and the photographs showing Robert caught mid-fall, her fingers tracing the exact edges of paper evidence, like a cartographer mapping danger. The wind stirred, carrying dust from the driveway into the air, and the sunlight caught on the gold lettering of the penalty notices, reflecting off the polished pink nails of Marjorie Blake's unseen hand in the background. The words, $500 per day, shimmering like a sentence carved in stone. Ethan's heart thumped as Lauren's eyes swept over the documents, then over the porch, over Robert's shaking hands, and her voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the oppressive tension. The HOA cannot use aesthetic standards to deny a reasonable modification for a disabled resident. It was not a suggestion. It was law. Without hesitation, Lauren opened her laptop, typing rapidly, the screen illuminating her sharp features as she composed an urgent demand for the HOA. Restore the ramp immediately. Halt any penalties, and provide full records of meetings, votes, and the supposed approval process for any disability accommodations. The sunlight caught on the dust motes swirling in the driveway, highlighting every floating particle as if the air itself had grown tense with the impending confrontation. Marjorie's response arrived almost immediately, an email dripping with condescension. "Maple Grove is not a hospital," she typed, words that landed in Ethan's inbox like a slap, and Lauren's finger hovered over the screen as she saved it, knowing that this arrogance would become a weapon, a piece of evidence that revealed the HOA's discriminatory intent. As the afternoon deepened, Ethan and Lauren walked the property together, the broken ramp a jagged scar across the porch, each board a reminder of how quickly control could be exerted over someone else's freedom. The more they investigated, the clearer it became. The HOA had no formal process for accommodating residents with disabilities. Every decision about ramps, rails, and accessibility had been made solely at Marjorie's discretion, and some of the signatures on the removal orders were unmistakably forged. Slightly too neat, the ink tone inconsistent, a subtle trace of deceit only a careful eye could catch. Ethan felt a mix of awe and fear at Lauren's skill, a growing hope that someone was finally able to fight back. But the shadow of retaliation loomed as the wind rattled the window frames and carried faint whispers from the neighbors' closed blinds. Later that evening, a knock on the door startled both Ethan and Robert. Nora Kim stepped inside, holding her phone, her face pale but resolute, and handed over the shaky footage she had captured of Robert's fall at the threshold. She also introduced evidence from 3 other residents: a former soldier, forced to remove his POW, MIA flag, an elderly woman coerced into dismantling her safety handrails, and a single mother whose child relied on visual markers outside the house for safety. The weight of their collective experience pressed into the room, a quiet but undeniable force, a network of shared oppression forming in real time. Ethan felt the tension spike, realizing that Marjorie's control extended far beyond their driveway, and the danger to anyone who dared to be different was systemic, not accidental. Lauren took each piece of evidence with care, organizing it into folders, making notes in the margins, her movements calm but precise, the room humming with a sense of impending escalation. Ethan noticed a small detail he had missed. The HOA's bylaws included no clause for emergency modifications, no mention of disability accommodations, and every supposed approval from other board members had either missing signatures or inconsistencies. He swallowed hard, realizing that the very rules Marjorie claimed to uphold were empty, her authority a fragile veneer over personal vendettas. As night fell, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long, eerie shadows over the Miller home. Ethan and Lauren sat in the living room, the shredded ramp boards leaning against the porch outside, a physical reminder of the morning's assault. Lauren finally closed her laptop with a deliberate snap, her eyes meeting Ethan's. The next step would not be subtle. She would file an emergency injunction in federal court. This was no longer just a fight for a ramp. It was a confrontation that could expose hidden abuses across the entire neighborhood. Cliffhanger. As Ethan placed the drawing from Oliver on the table, the bridge to the sun beside the broken boards, his phone vibrated with a new email notification. The subject line glowed ominously. Immediate response required. HOA legal threat. Ethan's pulse spiked as he opened it, and the first sentence made him freeze. Marjorie had already begun preparing a counterattack that could put his father's freedom, and possibly their safety, in jeopardy before the court even opened its doors. The courtroom lights glinted harshly off the polished wood, casting Marjorie Blake's pink suit in almost fluorescent brilliance as she stepped through the doors, a self-assured smile curling across her lips like a weapon she had wielded countless times before. Her white hair, sharp and precise, reflected the overhead lamps, creating a halo of cold authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room, making the walls themselves tense with anticipation. Ethan felt the air tighten in his chest, his pulse racing as if the space around the front row had shrunk, trapping his father in the gravity of the moment. Marjorie's gaze swept over the courtroom with calculated precision, eyes pausing briefly on Robert, who sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, trying to steady his breathing while the shattered memories of the ramp echoed in his mind. Every movement of her hand, the tilt of her head, the soft click of her heels against the floor, seemed choreographed to intimidate, and yet Ethan caught a flicker of unease in the furrow of her brow. A shadow she quickly masked. The hearing began, the judge's voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. But Marjorie immediately claimed the moral high ground, presenting her argument with fluid, practiced words. The ramp was ugly, disrupted the architectural flow, and had never been approved properly. Each claim was delivered with the confidence of a queen in her courtroom, and for a moment, it seemed the entire room might bend to her carefully rehearsed narrative. Lauren Pierce, calm as sunrise over winter fields, placed photographs on the table. Robert stuck at the threshold, hands clutching the wheels, his expression frozen in fear and frustration. Nora's shaky phone footage showing the dangerous fall. Marjorie's own email declaring Maple Grove is not a hospital. A folder of falsified signatures and documentation, showing other residents who had been denied essential accommodations. The courtroom seemed to contract with the weight of the evidence. Each photo, each email, each shaky signature speaking louder than Marjorie's practiced words. As the judge leaned forward, asking if the HOA had ever proposed a viable alternative for Robert, a silence fell heavier than any gavel could strike. Marjorie's face, perfectly composed, flickered for the briefest fraction of a second before she uttered a single, almost casual line. The family could manage on their own. The room froze. Ethan felt the air itself thicken, neighbors shifting in their seats, eyes wide, the magnitude of her callousness undeniable. Lauren's calm voice cut through, precise and unyielding, framing the truth with surgical clarity. Independence was a right, not a gift, and Robert did not need permission to leave his home safely. The words rippled through the courtroom, a pulse that made even the stenographer pause, fingers hovering over the keys, a shared understanding dawning that the stakes were bigger than a single ramp. Outside the window, the sun reflected off the polished wood of the courthouse steps, illuminating the dusty morning air, and Ethan's thoughts caught on a single horrifying possibility. Marjorie's authority was not just aesthetic control, it was personal, financial, systemic. Caleb, the young intern, had already discovered discrepancies in HOA records, special legal fees collected without invoices, money siphoned under vague pretenses, hidden among legitimate accounts. The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the chest. Marjorie was not just discriminating, she was manipulating the community's funds for purposes no one had questioned. And now the courtroom was only the first stage of the confrontation. Every angle, every shadow in the room seemed to hum with unspoken danger. The judge's gavel finally struck, a sound that resonated like a heartbeat through the tense chamber. The order was clear. The ramp must be restored within 48 hours, penalties halted immediately, and the HOA was forbidden from retaliating against the Millers or any witnesses. Simultaneously, an internal audit was ordered, a probe into potential abuses of power and misappropriation. Relief surged briefly through Ethan's chest, but the victory was fragile. Marjorie, for the first time, lost the practiced serenity of her composure. Her lips tightened, the pink suit somehow sharper, fiercer, as she fixed Ethan with a glare that carried a silent, chilling promise. "You have no idea what I'm capable of next." Ethan's gaze followed her as she exited, the heels clicking a measured, deliberate rhythm across the polished floor, leaving the courtroom stunned into quiet murmurs. Outside, the city light reflected in the glass of the courthouse doors, refracting her image into dozens of smaller, almost spectral versions, each one a reminder of the influence she had wielded unchecked. Caleb leaned closer, whispering that the financial anomalies needed immediate attention before Marjorie could cover any traces. The danger was no longer just about a ramp or a letter, it was a network, a hidden truth of misused funds and arbitrary authority. Cliffhanger! Ethan's phone buzzed, a notification glowing like a warning in the dim courtroom light. A new HOA statement had arrived, addressed to the Millers and the residents. The first sentence made his stomach drop. Emergency legal fees assessed, immediate payment required, or further action will be taken. As he read, he realized the pink suit might not only seek revenge, she could now weaponize the very system meant to protect them. The emergency HOA meeting began under flickering fluorescent lights, with rain ticking against the clubhouse windows like fingernails on glass. Every folding chair was filled, every wall lined with neighbors who had once watched from behind curtains. And at the front of the room stood Marjorie Blake, in the same flawless pink suit, her white shoulder-length hair tucked neatly beneath her ears, her smile stretched too tight to be calm. On the table before her lay a printed letter, accusing Ethan of exploiting his father's disability to destroy the community. And beside it sat another page, calling Nora Kim unstable, irresponsible, and dangerous to neighborhood order. Ethan sat beside Robert near the back, his father's wheelchair angled toward the aisle because the clubhouse entrance still had a lip in the doorway no one had ever bothered to fix. The irony burned in Ethan's throat. Robert said nothing, but his hands rested heavy on the wheels, the scrape on his wrist still visible beneath the cuff of his sweater. Across the room, Nora held Oliver's hand with one hand and a flash drive with the other, her knuckles pale. Her eyes locked on Marjorie like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff and finally deciding not to step back. Marjorie opened the meeting with the polished rhythm of someone used to controlling fear. She spoke of property values, hostile residents, legal costs, and the need to protect Maple Grove from people who wanted special treatment. The words moved through the room like cold smoke, familiar and poisonous, but this time they did not settle. No one nodded. No one looked down. The silence had changed shape. It was no longer submission. It was waiting. Then, Nora stood up. For a moment, even Marjorie seemed surprised. Nora was not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of person who usually challenged anyone in public. She walked to the screen at the front of the room, her son's fingers slipping slowly from hers, and plugged in the flash drive with trembling hands. The video began without music, without editing, without mercy. Robert appeared on the screen, trapped in his own doorway, while workers tore apart the ramp beneath him. His wheelchair jolted, his body tipped, and the room inhaled all at once, as if every person inside had been struck in the chest. Marjorie's face hardened, but the damage was already done. People were no longer hearing about a violation. They were watching a man lose his freedom plank by plank. A veteran named Frank Wallace rose next, his old jacket hanging loose over his shoulders, his voice low and rough, as he described how Marjorie forced him to remove a handrail from his porch because it looked too industrial. An elderly woman named Mrs. Alvarez stood after him, clutching her cane, admitting she had spent an entire winter afraid to sit outside because the rail that helped her reach the porch had been labeled an eyesore. One by one, the room filled with stories that had lived too long in private shame. Medical signs removed, safety lights denied, warning markers called clutter, human needs treated like neighborhood defects. Ethan watched the faces around him change from embarrassment to anger, and then from anger to recognition. Caleb stepped forward with a thin folder pressed against his chest, no longer looking like a nervous intern, but like someone who had found the door to his future and walked through it. He laid out the special legal fees Marjorie had charged residents after the court order, the maintenance payments made to contractors without board approval, the missing invoices, the signatures that did not match, and the private attorney expenses hidden under community protection. The hidden truth landed hard. Marjorie had not simply abused power to punish one family. She had used the entire neighborhood as a bank account and a shield. The back doors opened before Marjorie could recover. Lauren Pierce entered with a court order in one hand and the preliminary audit in the other, rain still shining on the shoulders of her dark coat. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The documents showed unauthorized spending, falsified meeting records, illegal retaliation after a federal order, and evidence that the ramp removal had been executed without valid board approval. The remaining board members stared at the pages as if they were seeing the neighborhood for the first time, not as lawns and mailboxes, but as a machine Marjorie had built to keep everyone afraid. Marjorie tried to speak, but the room had stopped belonging to her. Her pink suit, once a symbol of control, now looked like a cracked shell under the harsh clubhouse lights. Her smile vanished completely when the board secretary, hands shaking, called for an immediate vote to remove her as president. The motion passed with almost every hand in the room raised. Even people who had avoided Ethan's eyes for weeks now lifted their arms high, not just voting against Marjorie, but against the fear that had made them silent. Marjorie stood motionless as the decision became final. No dramatic scream came from her. No final victory line. Only a stunned, hollow stare as Lauren informed her that she faced civil action, financial investigation, and a no-contact order protecting the Miller family and every witness who had come forward. The room watched her walk out into the rain, the click of her heels softer than before, swallowed by the storm she had created and could no longer command. 2 days later, the oak ramp returned. This time, it was stronger. The boards were sealed smooth and golden. Black steel rails lined both sides, and at the bottom, the residents of Maple Grove installed a small brass plaque that read, "Access is dignity." Robert waited at the top in silence, sunlight spilling over his shoulders. While Ethan stood beside him with one hand resting on the rail. When Robert pushed forward, the wheels rolled smoothly down the slope. No jolt, no fear, no trapped breath. At the bottom, he stopped, closed his eyes, and took in the morning air as if it were the first honest breath he had taken in weeks. After that, Maple Grove changed in ways no one could have imagined. Ethan, Robert, Nora, and the residents formed an accessibility committee. The new HOA opened its finances, created a repair fund for seniors, veterans, disabled residents, and children with special needs, and passed rules that protected people instead of punishing them for needing help. Nora joined the board, no longer hiding behind curtains. Caleb chose civil rights law. Lauren stayed with the residents through the lawsuits, but the victory everyone remembered was quieter than any court order. It came weeks later, on an ordinary morning washed in gold. Robert rolled down the ramp by himself as Oliver ran across the street, holding a new drawing. This time, it was not a wooden bridge, leading one man toward the sun. It was the whole street, every front door open, every porch connected, and every neighbor standing outside together. Robert held the picture in both hands, his eyes shining, while Ethan looked down Maple Grove and realized the neighborhood had not lost its beauty when the ramp was built. It had finally found it. The lesson is simple. Dignity should never depend on someone else's idea of appearances. In everyday life, we may not always see the quiet struggles behind a ramp, a handrail, a sign, or a small accommodation, but compassion means making room for people to live with safety and independence. A truly beautiful community is not built by perfect lawns or matching houses, but by neighbors who choose kindness, fairness, and courage when someone vulnerable needs help. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and everyone watching.